The subject of the minimum equipment list for the SF50 is worth some time discussing, as SF50 pilots often have lots of questions about this topic. What is an MEL? Do I need one? How do I get authorization to use one? And once I have it, how do I use the MEL? Welcome to another real-world SF50 flying video. This one is titled Almost Everything You Wanted to Know About the SF50 Minimum Equipment List. Hello, I'm David Weeks. I've been flying professionally for over 50 years, starting as a CFI, then a charter pilot in light twins. I spent time as an air ambulance pilot in a Sorensen Metro and worked as a demonstration pilot for the Learjet factory. I had a 35-year airline career flying the 737-200 and 300, the A320 series, and I retired as a Boeing 787 captain. I am also a current CFII. I've got over 700 hours in the SF50, and I'd like to share my SF50 experiences with you. Now, there may be other YouTube channels that have glitzier production values than this one. I like to spend my time writing and teaching about the SF50, not doing post-production work. So just imagine this video is like a hangar chat session between friends. First, I do want to state clearly that the procedures in the Cirrus Vision Jet airplane flight manual and the material in the pilot's information manual are always controlling. This video is not flight instruction, nor is it ground school. These are simply my thoughts about the SF50 Master Minimum Equipment List. First, let me say that I could talk for a long time about all the finer points of MELs and their usage. But I want to focus on the fundamentals, and you, the video podcast watcher, can dive as deep into the rabbit hole as you like after finishing this basic overview. The term MEL stands for Minimum Equipment List. The term MMEL stands for Master Minimum Equipment List. And the difference is that the MMEL is created by the airplane manufacturer. An MEL is derived from the MMEL, meaning the Master MEL, and can be different from it, but it cannot be less restrictive than the Master. Now, while this difference is meaningful, I may use both terms interchangeably sometimes. The whole point of these FAA-approved documents is to allow you to dispatch the SF50 with inoperative components. Without being authorized to use either your own customized MEL or the Master MEL, the FARs require that every installed component on the Vision Jet to be working. And here's why. Let's look at FAR 91.213, Inoperative Instruments and Equipment. Now, 91.213 is a long and somewhat complex reg, and I don't want to read the whole thing out loud. Here's what I think are the essential bits that apply to us as SF50 operators. Little a, except as provided in paragraph D of this section, no person may take off an aircraft with inoperative instruments or equipment installed unless the following conditions are met. 1, an approved minimum equipment list exists for that aircraft. Okay, now let's skip to subparagraph little d. Little d says, except for operations conducted in accordance with paragraph A or C of this section, a person may take off an aircraft in operations conducted under this part with inoperative instruments or equipment without an approved minimum equipment list, provided 1, the flight operation is conducted in a little I rotorcraft, non-turbine powered airplane, glider, lighter than air aircraft, powered parachute, or weight shift control aircraft for which a master minimum equipment list has not been developed. Okay, since the SF50 is a turbine powered airplane, the various exceptions listed in little d do not apply. So we either have to have everything installed on the airplane in working condition, or we have an approved MEL and comply with it. And that, in a nutshell, is why virtually all SF50 operators want to have the ability to use either the SF50 Master MEL or an MEL for their airplane. Now, and this one's somewhat obvious, items like wings, ailerons, rudder pedals, and so on are not listed in the Master MEL. Well, why not? They're part of the fundamental aircraft definition in its type certificate and data sheet, and it would be both redundant and superfluous, how do you like that phrase, to have things like that listed in the Master MEL. Now, there are two types of MELs, the D095 MEL letter of authorization, and the D195 MEL letter of authorization. Again, without getting too deep into the regulatory weeds, the D095 is authorization for you to use the manufacturer's master MEL for your operation. The D195 MEL is authorization for you to use the manufacturer's master MEL as the basis for an MEL tailored specifically for your aircraft and operation. Now, the only reason for us as Part 91 operators to have a D195 MEL letter of authorization is if you regularly fly to Europe. How come? There's been an ongoing dispute between the FAA and the European ICAO member states as to whether or not a D095 MEL is in compliance with ICAO requirements. If you were to be ramp checked, say, in France, and we're using a D095 LOA, you could be in some trouble. Okay, fine. So we know what an MEL is for and what two kinds there are. How do you get permission to use one? Now, if you have way too much time on your hands, you could go through the process to learn about, fill out, and submit the application to your local FSDO, the Flight Standards District Office, the required forms and application for a D095 or a D195 MEL letter of authorization. Now, few people I know are foolish enough to try this on their own. Virtually everyone uses one of several companies that specialize in doing all the work required to get LOA approval from the feds. Wilding Air, Jet RVSM, AccuAero, and Nimble Smart Aviation are just a few that will do the work. I used Wilding Air for both my D095 MEL application as well as my RVSM LOA application. In each case, I answered a detailed questionnaire about my operation and the aircraft, sent them a check, and within a couple of weeks got the approval from my local FSDO, and it was perfectly painless. But if you want to do the application yourself, the requirements are specified in Advisory Circular 91-67A, minimum equipment requirements for general aviation operations under 14 CFR Part 91, according to 91.213. So knock yourself out. Now, while you're waiting for approval, you'll find it worthwhile to download and read and understand several FAA publications related to MEL usage. AC, or Advisory Circular 91-67A, which I just mentioned. MMEL Policy Letter 25, Revision 23. This is a list of definitions of terms used by MMELs and MELs. For example, this is where you would read the FAA definition of, quote, deactivated or secured. Now, that important term is defined as follows. Quote, when the MMEL refers to an item as deactivated or secured, or both, the specified item must be put into an acceptable condition for safe flight. An acceptable method of deactivating or securing may be either recommended by the manufacturer or established by the aircraft operator. Quote. You also need MMEL Policy Letter 36, Revision 3. This is the preamble to every Part 91 MEL approval. Now, I didn't get this with my MEL approval, and I don't know why not. You should absolutely get a copy and read it. For example, it tells us we added in D to the following language in the preamble, quote, the repair category intervals indicated by the letters A, B, C, and D in column 1 of the master MEL are not applicable to this MEL, but page 1 of 4 operators must comply with any provisos, conditions, limitations, or restrictions defining a repair interval, parenthesis, flights, flight legs, cycles, hours, days, etc. We're going to talk more about this little tidbit later. Okay, great. You got your letter of authorization from the FAA. Be sure to keep the emails and print them out as well. You're required to have the MMEL or MEL itself, depending on whether you requested a D95 or D195 letter, and the letter of authorization on the airplane. Now, together, they constitute a supplemental type certificate, or STC, for the airplane. And no, I have not investigated whether or not a PDF copy of both is acceptable in your electronic flight bag. The authorization also requires you to have a discrepancy log in the aircraft if you choose not to carry the actual airframe and engine logbooks. I put together a binder with the LOA, the master MEL, and a discrepancy log for recording discrepancies and maintenance sign-offs. I do not keep the actual aircraft airframe and engine logbooks on the airplane. Those live in my safe at home. I also keep in the airplane a collection of inoperative stickers and circuit breaker collars if one needs to be applied to comply with an MEL maintenance procedure. Now, for what it's worth, I've read in more than one location that the sticker needs to say inoperative and not just inop. Clearly, somebody in the FAA chain of command has no sense of humor. Okay, you've gotten your application approved by your local FSDO. You've printed everything out. You've got an assortment of circuit breaker collars and inoperative stickers in your discrepancy log. So, just exactly how do you use the MEL now that you are approved to use it? Let's say you're out on a flight and your weather radar fails to operate when turned on. There's no convective weather around, so you can complete the flight with no problems. Once parked, you bring out your MEL paperwork folder and look up weather radar in the master MEL document. Let's take a detailed look at the weather radar entry in the master MEL. The master MEL is organized by type of component or functionality. Section 34 is navigation. Section 35 is oxygen. Section 28 is fuel, and so on and so forth. Now, be advised, even though you have a paper copy of the master MEL in the airplane, I can assure you it is much faster to search through an electronic copy using a PDF reader on an iPad. We find weather radar in section 34, and the so-called sequence number is 40-01. Every component entry has 4 columns: repair category, number installed, number required for dispatch, and remarks or exceptions. The repair category for weather radar is category D. So what does that mean? As we said, there are 4 repair categories: A, B, C, and D. But in the SF50 Master MEL, you do not find any explanation for what defines each category. For that, you need to consult MEL policy letter 25, or ideally, the preamble to your approved MEL, which I mentioned earlier. We find that each category is a length of time in either hours or days of how long you can operate with the given component inoperative. For example, repair category C. This category item must be repaired within 10 consecutive calendar days, or 240 hours, excluding the day of discovery. For example, if it was recorded at 10 a.m. on January 26th, the 10-day interval would begin at 0000 on January 27th and end at 23:59 on February 5th. But we can thank someone in the FAA for making it easier for Part 91 MEL and Master MEL users. In Advisory Circular 91-67A, we find this: paragraph 2.2.4, repair categories. The repair category intervals, indicated by letters A, B, C, and D in column 1 of the MMEL, are not applicable to an MEL approved under the provisions of 91.213A, but operators must comply with any provisos defining a repair interval, examples of flights, flight legs, cycles, hours, days, etc. The operator must have any inoperative items, which are permitted to be inoperative, either repaired, replaced, removed, or inspected within the proviso defined repair interval period, or at the next required aircraft inspection, whichever comes first. And you can refer to 91.405c. So this means we do not have to get something fixed within the number of days for the category. But if the Master MEL says that in the remarks or exceptions column or a footnote that repairs must be made within some number of flights or engine cycles, we do have to comply with that. For example, if we look at the entry for the angle of attack sensor here, we find that even when complying with all the other requirements, repairs must be made within 3 flight days. Okay, what's a flight day, you may ask? This is why we have a copy of MEL Policy Letter 25. It defines a flight day, and it says a flight day is a 24-hour period from midnight to midnight, either in Coordinated Universal Time, UTC, or local time, as established by the aircraft operator, during which at least one flight is initiated for the affected aircraft. Okay, you got a problem with your emergency locator transmitter? It's a Category A component, but since we do not have to comply with Category A requirements, we do have to comply with a column 4 remark that says, quote, repairs are made within 90 consecutive calendar days. Now, most of the SF50 Master MEL component entries do not have flight day repair limitations. If not, when do we have to fix those components? Let's recall that Advisory Circular 91-67A, paragraph 2.2.4 said, the operator must have any inoperative items which are permitted to be inoperative either repaired, replaced, removed, or inspected within the proviso-defined repair interval period, or at the next required aircraft inspection, whichever comes first, and refer to 91.405C. Now, assuming we're Part 91 operators, there is no FAA requirement for anything other than an annual inspection. Yeah, sure, Jetstream requires 100-hour inspections, but those are not FAA required. So my reading, and your mileage may vary, is that unless there's a flight day or similar requirement in column 4, you don't have to fix a broken component until the next annual inspection. Of course, virtually every watcher of this video will have their airplane on Jetstream, so any broken widget is probably going to be fixed at the next 100-hour Jetstream inspection. All right, so much for column 1, the repair category. Column 2 is number installed, and that fortunately is pretty self-explanatory. Column 3 is number required for dispatch. Now this is important to understand. What does the word dispatch mean in the context of operating under the Master MEL? Again, let's consult Policy Letter 25, the definitions document, or the preamble to your approved MEL. Quote, this column indicates the minimum number or quantity of items required for operation, providing the conditions specified in the remarks or exceptions column are met. If the number required is predicated on an operating rule, see definition for required by 14 CFR, so on and so forth. A dash or NA may also be used for an EFAS or EFAS message relief, and I looked that up. EFAS stands for Engine Fire or Failure Advisory System. All right, at least to me, this explanation is not all that satisfactory. What does the word operation mean in this context? Unlike Part 135 or Part 121 operators, we Part 91 pilots do not have a formal dispatch or flight release process. So how do we know what to do when a component fails and when we have to comply with the requirements of the MMEL? Now, it's understood that once in flight, there is no requirement to comply with the MMEL or Master MEL restrictions for a given component failure. You comply with any checklist or FOM requirements. It's also obvious that if you discover a discrepancy during the pre-flight inspection or when you are doing the before taxi checklist, that you have to have it fixed. But what about when something fails during taxi but before takeoff? We know that you don't have to comply with the MEL when in flight, but what does in flight really mean? For MEL purposes, flight begins when you commence the takeoff, and that means advancing the thrust lever or throttle. FAA Policy Letter 25 defines takeoff like so. Quote, takeoff is the act of beginning a flight in which an aircraft is accelerated from a state of rest to that of flight. For the purposes of MEL relief, this translates to the point at which the pilot physically begins to apply power to initiate the takeoff from the runway or takeoff surface. Quote. So, if a component fails at any time from startup to the application of power for takeoff, you have to stop and comply with all the requirements of your master MEL or MEL. But once you stand up the power levers, you no longer have to comply with the MEL. If, say, at 50 knots on the takeoff roll, you get a message about a component failure, you are considered to be in flight for MEL compliance purposes. Now, if you had done a line up and wait and got the same message before applying power, you'd have to clear the runway and go through the entire MEL process to resolve your problem. All right, now that we have that issue cleared up, let's look at column 4, remarks or exceptions. This column list is what maintenance actions and what operator actions have to take place to be in compliance. Capital M for maintenance and capital O for operator. Let's start this with an easy one, as this topic becomes rather complicated. While taxing out, you see this CAS message, ECS control fail. One of the things it can mean is that all the cabin temperature sensors have failed. Look at 20-60-02 cabin zone temperature sensors in the MEL. 2 installed, 0 required for dispatch. Column 4 simply says for operator actions may be inoperative provided temp backup mode is verified operative. Quote. Now, there are no maintenance actions required to comply. All you, as the operator, have to do is to verify the temp backup mode works properly. Now, speaking for myself, I would bring up the environmental systems page and visually confirm that the temperature control valve or TCV valve moves in response to changing the desired temperature using the hot or cold temperature control rotary knob. Assuming it does, you still have one more task to comply with before being legal to take off. In your maintenance or discrepancy log, you have to document the sensor failures and that you verified proper operation of the temp backup mode. Now let's examine a more complicated MEL compliance example. Taxing out, you get a red yaw annunciation in the AFCS status part of the primary flight display. It means yaw damper control failure. So you pull over, you set the parking brake, or you shut down and look up the yaw damper. It's 22-10-02, Ruddervator Yaw Damper System. It's category C for repair, but we can ignore that. It says 1's installed and 0 are required for dispatch. Good. So we can fly without it. But what about the M and O entry in column 4? It says, quote, M and O may be inoperative provided the yaw damper circuit breaker is pulled and collared. Quote, circuit breaker A5 on the pilot side is for the yaw damper. All we have to do is pull and collar it, make the discrepancy log entry, and launch off, right? Well, cowboy, it may not be that simple. Now, if you're a licensed A&P mechanic, then you can do the pulling and collaring and sign off yourself, no questions asked. But what if you're not a licensed A&P, just a pilot? Can you pull and collar the breaker and sign off the entry? You know, Part 43, the FAR that regulates aircraft maintenance, contains Appendix A, which lists 31 things a pilot may perform himself as preventive maintenance. And many of these are far, far more complex than collaring a circuit breaker. How about replacing prefabricated fuel lines, perhaps? That's preventive maintenance. So collaring a circuit breaker is no big deal, right? Again, Advisory Circular 91-67A answers the question. But this time, the answer's not so good for pilots who are not A&Ps. Now, this is a bit long, but I'm going to read it all as it's very important to understand this issue. Paragraph 4.2.2, deactivation. When an item is deactivated or secured, or both, the specified item must be put into an acceptable condition for safe flight. Deactivation may involve more than simply turning off a system switch, which does not remove power from the system. Deactivation may involve pulling and securing the circuit breaker and/or removing the equipment. Deactivation of an operative system is not preventive maintenance as described in Part 43, Appendix A. Regardless of the method of deactivation, a person authorized to approve the aircraft for return to service under 43.7 must make the maintenance record entry required by 43.9. No person may operate the aircraft without the entry required by 43.9. Next paragraph says, only appropriate qualified maintenance personnel may conduct procedures requiring specialized knowledge or skill or requiring the use of tools or test equipment. The satisfactory accomplishment of all maintenance procedures, regardless of who performs them, is the responsibility of the operator. An appropriately authorized person must accomplish the deactivation. Okay, so the advisory circular says that a mechanic has to pull and collar the yaw damper breaker and do the write-up. Now, are you at a field without any maintenance? This could be a problem. Now, the legal eagles amongst us may chime in here saying that advisory circulars are advisory. They're not FARs, and so not legally controlling. Such a legal eagle may say to call an inspector at your FSDO and ask him if you can do the M items when no special tools are required. And he may say yes. Of course, another inspector in another FSDO may say no. And people in the aviation business long enough know that there may be considerable differences in FAR interpretations between FSDOs. Now, to add to the confusion, this is what Policy Letter 25 says about M for maintenance action items. Quote, this symbol indicates a requirement for a specific maintenance procedure that must be accomplished prior to operation with the listed item in operative. Normally, these procedures are accomplished by maintenance personnel. However, other personnel may be qualified and authorized to perform certain functions. Procedures requiring specialized knowledge or skill or requiring the use of tools or test equipment should be accomplished by maintenance personnel. Quote, now, some M actions in the SF50 master and MEL are complex and clearly should not be performed by mere pilots. For example, MEL 21-50-01, air conditioning system. It can be MEL'd, but the M action says M may be inoperative provided air conditioning system is deactivated. Quote, deactivating the entire air conditioning system is much more involved than just pulling a circuit breaker, and I'd say this clearly needs a mechanic to do the work. Now, this is a sensitive subject. I'm going to wrap up this topic by saying read and educate yourself on the various FAA documents and decide for yourself about what M actions, if any, you can perform if you don't hold an ANP ticket. But there are a few more MEL sticky wickets to wade through. As I mentioned earlier, items not listed in the MEL are considered to be required for dispatch. Wings, ailerons, doors, engines, that sort of thing. But there are many little items that are not part of the type certificate and data sheet description of the airplane. For example, fresh air gas vents in the passenger cabin. They're not listed in the master MEL for the SF50. They are certainly not critical airworthiness items. So, what are you going to do? Many manufacturers have created what's called a non-essential furnishings list. It's just what the title says, a list of components not in the MEL and how to handle them when they're not working. It's also known as an NEF list. Now, unfortunately, Cirrus has not yet published an NEF list for the SF50. So, what should you do when a passenger gas vent fan is not working correctly? Guys, I'm taking the Fifth Amendment on that one. You can figure it out for yourselves. Lastly, the nose circuit breaker panel for the SF50 is located behind a large access panel on the forward right side of the fuselage. It's secured by plain vanilla Zeus fasteners, which can be released by a screwdriver. I'd say that a screwdriver is not a special tool, and that specialized knowledge is not required to remove the panel to access the nose circuit breaker panel. But your opinion and that of your local FAA inspector may be different. Okay, wrapping up, here's some of the main points I'd like to leave you with about MELs and master MELs. One, I would use a professional service to do the application. When you do get the approval, print out and carry a copy of all the paperwork on the airplane. Two, read the various FAA policy letters and Advisor Circular 91-67A and the preamble document. Read them carefully. 3, understand how to handle discrepancies that occur during taxi but before takeoff. And 4, think about what actions you can and cannot perform on your own. All right, thanks for watching this episode of Real World SF50 Flying. I hope you learned a lot about the ins and outs of MEL usage for your SF50.